Okay, there's plenty signing in, so we'll get started, shall we? Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today for our first in a new discussion series dedicated to psychiatric drug withdrawal. And on behalf of our partners, the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry and the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, we're so grateful that so many of you decided to join us. My name is James. I work for Mad in America as the host of the MIA podcast. And before we get started today, I want to touch on what we hope to achieve with these discussions. So, our aim really with this series is to get to discuss honestly and openly the many issues faced by those wanting to come off psychiatric drugs safely. So, partnering with the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry and the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, we hope to collect together experience and knowledge that will add to an important societal discussion. So we aim to explore what we do and don't know about safe withdrawal from antidepressants, antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, and stimulants. And we will be discussing the knowledge, skills, and experience necessary to support those who might be having a difficult time getting off psychiatric drugs. And by doing this, we hope to stimulate further discussion between service users and prescribers. And so, as this is the first in our series, what we hope to do today is to have a scene setting discussion. And I'm delighted to have with us a panel of people who can help us explore some of the issues. But before we get underway with an introduction to the panel, I do want to mention the people who work hard behind the scenes to make these calls possible. Firstly, we have Shira Collins, and Shira works with Mad in America Continuing Education, and she'll be making sure that the event runs smoothly today. We also have Lucy Fernandez. Lucy's looking after the chat and moderating viewer questions. Lucy's the administrator of the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. So we have an hour and a half today, and the first hour is devoted to a panel discussion, and then the final 30 minutes for viewer questions. And I just want to talk about dealing with questions for a minute. So please do feel free to ask questions, and we will be selecting questions for the panel in the final part of the session. We won't be able to address all of your questions in the time that we have, but if we don't get to your question, we will try and make sure it's built into the discussion in some of our future sessions. To ask a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. The reason for this is that questions placed in the chat are easy to miss. So if you put them in the Q&A selection, then Lucy will be able to find them. Please bear in mind that anything you write in the chat or in the Q&A can be seen by everybody. I also have to say that the panel won't be able to respond to questions surrounding individual circumstances with withdrawal. Now, I know this will disappoint some of you to hear, but addressing individual difficulties in this kind of forum is very hard because there are so many variables and complexities. And before we go any further, it's most important to say that if you are someone considering coming off your psychiatric drugs, please never stop suddenly or abruptly. If at all possible, please seek advice from a knowledgeable professional. And the panel today and for future discussions is not providing medical advice or making specific recommendations regarding withdrawal from psychiatric drugs. Our aim really is to explore and discuss. For those of you watching who might be new to these issues, we have a page of resources that you can visit to find out more. And this can be found by visiting the website madinamerica/PDW. And I'll try and add that in the chat in a minute. So I hope that's all clear. Thrilled you can join us, all of you, and onto the panel. And thrilled also to say we have a wealth of experience with us today. So without any further ado from me, I'd like to ask the panel members to introduce yourselves. And could you also say a little bit about what brought you to your interest in withdrawal issues? And Adele, could we start with you?
Sure. Thank you, James. Um, I went off Paxil in 2004 over a few weeks. I was under the supervision of a outpatient psychiatric clinic. I developed severe withdrawal. I spoke to them about it. I They didn't seem to know what to do, and consequently, Um, I requested reinstatement of paroxetine, but I didn't get it. And I, of course, being a patient, I didn't know exactly what to do at that point. So consequently, I ended up getting protracted withdrawal syndrome, and it took me 11 years to recover. And I believe that I might be the longest documented recovery from from antidepressant withdrawal syndrome. Um, so in the course of my difficulties, I very reluctantly joined an online support group, Paxil Progress at that time, and where people who had had similar problems were sharing information and um, doing their really doing their own research, and I was doing a lot of reading in the medical literature myself to try and figure out what was going on. Um, so at that time, there were probably a half a dozen or a dozen similar peer support sites on the web. That was in around 2005. And that was the only place where people could come to discuss this problem that they were having. Almost all of them said that they were unable to find a doctor who was any help at all. And at that point, people were also discussing, like what caused withdrawal, and the conclusion was that they had all tapered too fast. Um, so there was some discussion about tapering at that time also. Uh, then after I was a member there for perhaps 6 years, and the site, as online communities do, declined, and other members asked me to start another site. So I started survivingantidepressants.org in 2011, and currently the site has 14,000 members. I designed it so that we could collect case histories, and there are about 6,000 case histories of people tapering and of withdrawal syndrome and recovery from withdrawal as well, on my website, which we're starting to do research based on those case histories. And I am fortunate to be co-author with Michael Hentgartner and other co-authors on a paper that was just published about protracted withdrawal syndrome, um, surveying 69 cases of protracted withdrawal syndrome, which is now the authoritative paper on the subject. And that was just published on Christmas Eve.
James, you're on mute.
James, yeah.
Sorry. Thanks, Adele. Thanks. Many of the viewers will know you well and know your work, and we're delighted to have you with us. Luke, could we move on to you next?
People might know me as Altistrada. I've used that pseudonym. I'm sorry, I should have introduced myself. I'm sorry for interrupting you, James.
No worries. Over to you, Luke.
Adele, I knew you for many years as Altistrata, and I always wondered who it was behind that particular name, and I was delighted to meet you in London a couple of years ago. We had a very good lunch together. My story, similarly to Adele, started with taking these drugs. I was on initially Prozac. I was given it after a bad reaction to an operation that I had in my early 20s, and just left on it by my GP. Suffered side effects, had other drugs added to it. Eventually, sort of 10 years later, I was on, I think, 4 different drugs, 2 of them to counteract the side effects of the other 2. One included a sleeping pill. And I was back in the UK. I'd spent some time in the States. And I was seeing a doctor, and I said, listen, I'm getting really forgetful. I'm not sure these drugs are doing me any good, and why am I on them anyway? And he said, well, Luke, you can come off the fast way or the slow way. And I said, well, I'm busy running a business. I'd like to come off the fast way. And he said, great, write me a big check and you can come into this hospital and I'll take you off in a detox. And at that point, I was running a big film school and had a lot of other things to think about. And I thought, I'll just be out in a couple of days, no problem. And I was taken off cold turkey, which is something that should never happen. And my world fell apart. I couldn't function at all. I spent the next 3 years stuck at home, unable to work, unable to leave the house. I used to look up at the sky and think all kinds of crazy things were happening. I mean, it was a horrific experience, but gradually I started to get better. I'm in the UK and I'm lucky to have various connections with people in Parliament over here, including my father. And we started to make contact with the people that we thought could make a difference. And that kicked off with a conference that was held by the BMA back in 2014. And for the first time, the British Medical Association over here brought doctors together to discuss this issue of withdrawal from these drugs. And that was really the starting point for quite a lot of change over here. At that time, I teamed up with James Davis, who some of you will know, who's written a book called Cracked, Why Psychiatry Does More Harm Than Good, highly recommended. And James and I set up, co-founded CEP in the UK, the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry. And as my background was partly in film, we made quite a lot of films on that website. If you haven't been to the site, it's quite a good one. We've gathered lots of research. We've got patient testimonials. We've got support for people looking to come off, cepuk.org. And after the BMA conference, we got involved with a parliamentary group in the UK. So there is now a parliamentary group that is focused on prescribed drug dependence. It's called the APPG for Prescribed Drug Dependence. And we've been lobbying government over the past 5 years to bring about changes, and in particular, to bring about services to help people to come off. And this led around about 3 years ago to a big review that was done over here in the UK by Public Health England, which came out with various recommendations, recognized the scale of the problem, the vast numbers of people, 25% of the adult population taking one of these drugs, antidepressants, sleeping pills, opioids, gabapentinoids. And they've made various recommendations which the Department of Health, but in particular NHS England over here, are in the process of looking at and hopefully implementing. I can't talk too much about exactly what's going on because we're right in the midst of it, but we are quietly confident that there will be changes here, that there will be opportunities for people to access services to help them come off, and hopefully in due course a helpline and other things as well. So I spend part of my time trying to make sure that that happens in the UK, with obviously the help and support of lots of good colleagues, including John.
Thank you so much, Luke. And again, thank you for all your sterling work in this area. Swapnil, could we move on to you next? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah. First of all, thank you so much to Mad in America for facilitating this very, very important conversation. I think this is the way to go, putting people together and having an open, transparent discussion about this topic, because I think medical professionals really, really need more help in the area. So I'm a psychiatrist by training. I've worked both in India as well as in 2 different cities in the US. I worked in Brooklyn for a little while, in New Haven, and I'm back in New York City right now. I work at an outpatient psychiatry clinic of a large hospital here. How I initially got interested in this work was probably from the other end of what Adele and Luke's experience has been. As I was looking at the number of prescriptions that patients were receiving, I found that A lot of times people were on medications that didn't seem to be doing anything, or that were there for no clear reason at all. And when we started tapering them off, I found somewhat, not even somewhat, a huge discrepancy between uh, what the patient's experience was of tapering the drugs off, especially antidepressants, and what the textbooks said. So classic medical literature says that most antidepressant withdrawal is a mild, self-limiting syndrome, and it typically disappears between 4 to 6 weeks, which in practical experience is largely untrue. It might be true for a very, very small percentage of people. And I often found myself in the situation where I just didn't know what to do when patients were really struggling with withdrawal. So I'm really grateful to be a part of this community and to learn from the other panelists. I've learned a lot talking with them, reading their work. And right now my focus is helping people taper off medications should they want to do that. And the the framework that I use for that kind of work is building a strong therapeutic alliance, exploring different sources of information together, and building an individualized plan for the patient, and adjusting doses as we go and maintaining a really flexible plan. So once again, I'm really, really happy and grateful to be here. I'm looking forward to a great discussion today.
Thank you so much, Swapnil. And again, you literally wrote the book "Deprescribing in Psychiatry." So I hope we get to talk about some of that today. So thank you for joining us. And last but by no means least, of course, John. Pleasure to have you with us. If we could hear a little bit from you, that would be great. Good.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. I'm just watching all the names come across the bottom of the screen here. I've counted 16 different countries so far. A special kia ora to Danny from New Zealand. Go New Zealand. Was 20 years in Aotearoa, so nice to see you. Got up at 7 o'clock in the morning. Well done. So I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of East London. Most of my research for the whatever many years it's been now has been in the psychosis and antipsychotic area. Until recently, I knew a lot less about antidepressants. So I've been learning in the last few years more about that. I got really pulled over by the likes of Luke and James 3 or 4 years ago, because we had published the two of the largest surveys of people on antidepressants. The first one was in New Zealand when I was still there, about 2,000 people, and we were finding that about 50 to 55% of people reported withdrawal effects if they were asked, which of course they often aren't in the real world. And we also found that about half of those people were describing their withdrawal symptoms as severe. So that sort of research led me to be sort of helping Luke, James, and other people with the Public Health England review, which I'll leave Luke to talk about later, because there's some quite amazing things happening in England at the minute. There's some things we're not very proud of also, which we won't be talking about tonight. But we are pleased that we seem to be taking a lead at the moment in this sort of area. So I've ended up as chair of the International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, which is a great honor and a privilege. Swapnil is on the board with me. Dad and Lucas and James associate members. So that's a very important organization which is trying to be a figurehead really internationally to make sure these issues are recognized. I'm also part of the group of people who wrote a guidance for psychological therapists and counselors, which I'll put a link up to it when I've finished talking, which was very important to me because our profession had pretty much abandoned people, I think. Clinical psychology had sort of abandoned these issues, along with psychotherapists, to be honest, to the medical professions. And the medical professions were making a complete mess of it. But we were being even more neglectful by not getting involved at all and saying it's not our business. So we have written a guidance for therapists and counselors as to how to engage with their clients around these issues, rather than say it's nothing to do with me. So that's kind of an important document. And I guess overall, I've always, right from the beginning, been not surprised anymore, but amazed by how the extent to which we medicalize human distress and all of the problems that that causes. In Britain, the figures will be not so different in most countries. America's pretty much the worst, but in Britain, we are at the point where now 1 in 6 people were prescribed antidepressants last year. And when you add the other ones like benzodiazepines, the figures get up to 1 in 4. Higher rates for women, maybe we'll be talking about that at some point today, and higher rates in our deprived areas. So if you're a woman living where I live in Newham, your chances of being on antidepressants is probably 50%. And that scares me. So anyway, it's very good to be with you all today. I'm really looking forward to a really positive discussion, and it's good to see these issues finally coming out into the open after having been buried for decades. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all of you for, being involved in this kind of kicking off discussion. This kind of setting the scene, this foundation is so important, I think, for the rest of the series in terms of discussing some more of the detail. So what I'd like to do now is kind of open it up to a bit of a panel discussion. So please feel free to, input as you'd like to, according to your preference and experience. But what I'd like to ask first is for your thoughts and reflections on some of the developments that you've all been describing, and there have been some developments in the UK, some in the US. I think the conversation about withdrawal is increasing in intensity. It might be slow, but this is the results of many years worth of campaigning. So, can I have your reflections on where we've been and where we need to go, and also on your views on what we know and, more importantly, perhaps don't know about the experience of withdrawal?
Who's going first?
From the point of view of the people from my point of view and the people on my website, they're always very surprised about it, and often well, they find the symptoms very disturbing, and the combination of the surprise and the severity of the symptoms often causes them to believe that something has gone seriously haywire, that they've really suffered a psychiatric collapse. So they'll call it a breakdown sometimes. And because of that, they might have gone through a series of attempts to find treatment and gotten all kinds of perhaps subsequent drugs, and had terrible reactions to them, until finally they realize that their doctors don't really know what's going on, and then they trace back their original problem to going off the drug. So it seems to be a slow realization process. Everyone who accepts the prescription for the psychiatric drug, well, let me say most people who accept the prescription believe that they're going to help, and that their doctors will be a resource if something goes wrong. And when this doesn't this doesn't pan out in a situation of severe adverse reaction, they become quite disillusioned, and that's another layer of psychological distress. People can experience it as a real existential shock, that there's really no medical safety net for what's happened to them. The sense of betrayal is very difficult. And all of this is lumped under depression, but it really should not be called a psychiatric disorder. Withdrawal is very, very different. And it's an iatrogenic condition, which means that it's caused by treatment, and people react emotionally to that, to the discomfort and to the situation they find themselves in. They feel helpless and betrayed.
When I was first going through withdrawal, and I went to go and see my doctor, there was really complete denial. And I think that's a very common response. I think that there's obviously a lot missing in the training, and that's been one of the areas that PHE and this review has focused on, the need for greatly improved doctor training. In this country, when people, when you go to medical school, you have a huge bank of questions that you're asked that come out of a multiple choice database. And when some analysis was done of that, it turned out that there were only 3 or 4 out of thousands that related to this question of withdrawal from prescribed drugs. So it's really sort of glossed over. And that's where obviously a lot of change needs to occur. And we see some evidence that that's being looked at. And that's what I think of as an upstream problem, that we've got this issue of withdrawal. We've got the upstream issue of doctors not understanding it. We've got the upstream issue of the guidance not sufficiently recognizing it. And that those two things need to be solved to stop the flow of people who are inappropriately prescribed and then end up in trouble. But we've got a huge downstream problem as well, which is all the people who are on these drugs who shouldn't be on them, and all the people on these drugs who want to come off safely, and how do they access services appropriately to do that. And, and I remember very clearly when I first entered withdrawal, I was in a clinic in London called the Priory, and I'd been taken off these drugs pretty much cold turkey. And I thought, I knew something terrible had gone wrong. And the doctor denied it, and I went straight onto the internet, and my heart sank as I saw these stories of people taking years and years to recover in some cases. In many cases, people recover much more quickly, but when you've been on for a long time and you're taken off quickly, it can take a long while. And so, you know, it's fairly clear that we've got a multi-pronged approach that needs to be taken. We've got to make sure that the training is improved. We've got to make sure that the guidance is improved. And we've got to make sure that the people who need the help now can access that help. And it is quite wrong that really the only reliable place for support has historically been the internet and peer support of others. Of course, peer support is a wonderful, wonderful thing, but it ought to be the medical profession that steps forward and understands they provided the drugs in the first place, and then provides the support to help others to come off. And obviously that is where a lot of attention is being applied at the moment.
Yeah, I would really second what both Adele and Luke said, that from the psychiatrist's point of view, you know, I belong to a number of psychiatrists, peer support groups where we are discussing among ourselves difficult clinical situations. And ever so often a case of antidepressant withdrawal will come up, and everyone is just flummoxed. We're wondering what to do. And one random psychiatrist will suggest dropping down the dose by 50%, then by another 50%, and stopping the drug completely within 6 to 8 weeks, and which can be very, very problematic for a big percentage of patients. So I think we certainly need more education among psychiatrists. I think there is a will to, albeit small, there is a will to understand this issue and try and help patients through it. But I think this also leads us to a deeper issue within medicine, that is of how do we foster transparency and how do we build a tolerance for uncertainty. Because I think a lot of withdrawal is actually navigating uncertainty and maintaining a good relationship and a good and transparent relationship with the patient. That when you don't have some answers, you're able to tell the patient that, I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what's the best way forward. All I can assure you is that I'm going to be available and we'll work through this together. So I think that it does lead us to a deeper issue in medicine, and it's an issue that some medical schools have been building into their curriculum, actually, of more patient-centered work, where the trainees are actually listening to what their patients are saying and are not so focused on what they already know from what they've studied back home, and also building this tolerance for uncertainty and communicating information clearly to patients in an understandable way, meaning that it's not just jargon and numbers.
I think if we could get doctors and clinical psychologists and everybody to sit with that uncertainty, Swapna, we would have far fewer people on the medications in the first place. I mean, the majority of people prescribed antidepressants is for mild and moderate levels of depression, for which the guidance says antidepressants are not recommended nor effective. And the idea that depression is a response to depressing things happening seems to have got lost somewhere. And that we all have stressors from time to time. And the answer is not always a chemical one. It's a terrible cliche, but time is quite a good healer. So the saying goes. But at the minute, we're rushing to prescription pads at a ridiculous rate. And that, of course, has increased during the pandemic. We just had figures out in England saying that in the first, over a 3-month period, 6 million people were prescribed antidepressants, which is an increase of 2 or 3-fold over our usual astonishingly high rate. But just to go back to the people were texting at the bottom there in the chat about informed consent, which is hugely important. So let me just comment on that. Our surveys show that about 1% of people are told about withdrawal effects when they are first prescribed antidepressants. 1%. That is unethical and negligent, but it comes from the fact that the guidelines they are following are so wrong. As Swapnil said, they've been described for ages as antidepressant withdrawal has been described as a self what's the right word? It sorts itself out within 2 to 4 weeks, and it's mild, etc., etc. Now we've won that battle in England. Some of you have got to still fight that battle, but in England we've got the Royal College of Psychiatrists to change its mind, having denied the reality for decades. Last year they did a U-turn and acknowledged that the research is actually correct rather than the opinions of a few powerful psychiatrists and the drug companies. NICE guidelines here have changed. So we're getting that information out now, so GPs will no longer look up their guidance and find the wrong information. So that's a huge step forward, and we're hoping that the lead we've taken here in England might be followed elsewhere around the world, so that people can start getting accurate information from the beginning, so that I think fewer will take antidepressants if they knew what was to come later, but also more people are likely to get support when they report the withdrawal to their doctors, because they're not going to be told, no, that's the depression coming back, that's not the withdrawal effects. So we are making some progress here.
There's another hopeful activity over here which is being supported, and that's social prescribing. And I think that as we look over the next decade or so, we're going to see a tremendous impact, positive impact from social prescribing. In this country, a lot of funding has been released through the NHS to support social prescribing, meaning that you'll have what are called social prescribing link workers. These are individuals working with doctors' surgeries who will be individuals that can link that surgery with other things that patients may want to do before they start off on a prescription for drugs. So they may be prescribed things like gardening, or they may be suggested to join a choir, or they may be volunteering, or there may be other types of activities that are non-drug that are just more appropriate, so that the doctor doesn't feel that they have to write a prescription. And I went to a very telling conference once, again at the BMA, and it was about this issue of withdrawal, and a lot of senior doctors there, and they were amazing to me, because some of them were standing up and saying, well, we get these very demanding patients and they come in and they tell us they must have a prescription for this or for that, and we don't really have any choice. We feel that we have to write a prescription for them. And I have some sympathy that patients can put doctors under a lot of pressure, but when it comes to making a decision to prescribe a drug, that is a terribly, terribly serious decision, and potentially life-changing for that person who starts off on a journey of dependence and ultimately withdrawal, which, as many of us know, can be quite life-changing. And if at that moment the doctor had an alternative, and obviously there are other talking therapies that are part of this mix as well, but if they've got more opportunities for alternatives, I think we will hopefully find that those are embraced and fewer people start off on this path. But the problem is that we've already got 25% of the country on these drugs, and we've got to do something about that. We've got to now go through a process of reaching out to those patients, helping them, because many people don't realize that they're taking drugs that are potentially harmful to them if taken long term. That's a huge problem. So there's a whole outreach that needs to occur. And then we've got to have conversations and help them to withdraw. And that is a massive, massive task. And I hope that some of the things that are going to happen in the UK will be helpful for other countries as well. It's not as though the UK is the only place that is trying to tackle this. But we are hopeful that there are changes underway that might mean that in 10 years or so, things will look somewhat different. And I think social prescribing is potentially a big part of that.
Thank you. A few of you there have mentioned differences in approach and differences in response around the world, and I feel it's important to kind of address that and pick that up from perhaps a social justice or an equality perspective. And I know that Swapnil, you've done some work on this and some thinking about it. So I wondered if you could help us understand, some of the issues that maybe other parts of the world are facing in terms of this challenging issue of withdrawal and dependence.
Yeah, that's been one of my concerns since I've started on this work of helping people taper psychotropics, that there is only a certain percentage of the population that can afford to taper their medications. For instance, when you work in public mental health settings in the United States, we get patients who are low income or are working full time. The example that immediately comes to mind was a young woman on sertraline who wanted to taper it off, but who just couldn't afford to do it because she had to show up to work every day. So she made enough money to feed her kids. And withdrawal does entail, does need a certain amount of time and dedication to that specific venture. So my solution to the problem is that, as John was pointing out, for mild or moderate depressions, this medication should just not be the first line of treatment, and potential withdrawal reactions should be factored into the discussion while decision to take medication or not. So I think this idea of withdrawal should be introduced at the time of prescribing, and the patient should think about it, that when I am going to try and stop this medication, it's going to become problematic for me. So should I actually take it or not? I think that's one part of it. And the other part of it, that keeps coming up for me these days, is when I try and think about tapering antipsychotics for young Black men, I am scared. Even though I know that they don't need to be on antipsychotics, I'm afraid that what if they have a relapse? What if they're seen on the street, in a disorganized state or hallucinating, especially because of the tensions between law enforcement and how law enforcement interacts with race. I'm scared. So I could be more cautious about that, and sometimes I bring it up with the patients as well, and we think about it together. But this is a larger issue that IIPDW, Mad in America, all of us should be thinking about. That we need to make withdrawal strategies, or rather we need to tailor withdrawal strategies for use in all settings. I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you. That is very important. And one of the threads that I'm seeing both in the comments and also in what you're talking about is the issue of being believed when you are someone that's having difficulty with withdrawal. So, many of people have said, and I've experienced this myself, you go to your doctor and they say it's nothing to do with the drug, you must be unusually sensitive. So, it strikes me there is an absolute wealth of experience on Facebook, on surviving antidepressants, on Compass, Mad in America. All these other sites have such excellent information. How do we go about convincing doctors and psychiatrists who remain unconvinced? How do we go about convincing them that withdrawal is a very big issue, needs very careful management, and there is knowledge and learning out there that needs to be transferred? I wondered if any of you had any thoughts on
that. I think that first we need to understand that most psychiatric treatment is conducted by GPs. And so discussing problems with psychiatrists, discussing the systemic problems with psychiatrists doesn't necessarily even get communicated with GPs, especially in the United States where the medical system is decentralized. So many people have been informed by mass media and by advertising and such that antidepressants are a wonderful solution, and they go and they ask their doctors for antidepressants. So we have to counter that information, and the way that I see it is that we to reach GPs as well as psychiatrists. We have thousands of ambassadors who can talk to the doctors, and those are the patients themselves. And I believe that what we should do is to provide materials for the patients so they can present that to their doctors. And also we need to train the patients how to talk to doctors, because even if they're upset about their symptoms or they have they become uncertain about the doctor's knowledge, confronting the doctor or raising your voice with a doctor just confirms a doctor's opinion that you have a mental disorder rather than some information that they might really need to present. So, so I would like to somehow communicate this information to patients so they can take it to their doctors. And I think that that might be the most effective way to the doctors don't want to hurt people, and they, if they may not immediately react to and agree with someone who says, I'm having a terrible reaction to this drug, but they remember that and they might incorporate that understanding into their practice going on. So I think that at this point, there are so many people who are having problems that they can take this information to their doctors.
I think if I can pick up on that, Adele, one of the things that we tried to do with CEP was to provide evidence summaries that people could download and print and take to their doctors. They're actually in need of a bit of an update, and James and I and others must get on and do that. But still on the CEP site, you've got various things that you can use in that regard. I don't think doctors' practice, frankly, is going to change until both the training and the guidance changes. Those are the two critical things. Hopefully, I also sit on the NICE commission on safe prescribing and withdrawal, and we're halfway through a process looking at all the evidence around safe prescribing and withdrawal, and hopefully that new guidance will take forward what has already been done. We saw a really important change around the recognition of antidepressant withdrawal, the severity and the duration of symptoms. That was reflected in the existing depression guidance, CG90. But the new commission is going to come out with new guidance. I'm also hopeful that one of the ideas that was talked about before around informed consent is going to play a much bigger role. It's interesting that over here, the GMC, which is the General Medical Council that regulates doctors and ultimately can strike them off, has a new section on shared decision making, and within that are some very clear language around informed consent. We would like to see what we call an informed consent agreement, and that is something that at the beginning of a prescription captures various critical pieces of information, captures the diagnosis, captures that there's been a discussion about harms and benefits, how long the prescription is going to be for, that there is a plan at the outset of a prescription for coming off. There's no point in starting a prescription without a plan for coming off, given how we know these drugs behave. It has the date for the next review. It has advice for monitoring if there are any side effects and symptoms. That would be a big step change, I think, if systems could be put in place so that doctors are required to create such an agreement at the start of the prescription. And I'm not saying that that is going to happen anytime soon, but I think it's something that different healthcare systems ought to aim for. And with electronic health records, it ought to be relatively straightforward to implement and quick to do. I think that would be quite a game changer if we could achieve that at some point.
I would hope that in the United States that doctors would be influenced by what's going on in the UK and possibly Europe in terms of updating the information about psychiatric drug withdrawal. But in the United States, it's, again, very decentralized, and doctors are very much on their own. They don't necessarily even keep updated in their own specialties. But the materials that you're producing in the UK could be very useful in terms of patients being able to inform their doctors with the latest developments, at least elsewhere, and perhaps put a seed of doubt in their minds about changing their practices. Again, in the United States, one area that needs to be that might be amenable to change is medical training, especially of the allied health professions, such as nursing and physician assistants and such, who often get delegated what's considered to be the easy task of prescribing antidepressants to the hordes that come in demanding antidepressants. Honestly, in the United States, this is considered to be an absolute no-brainer decision when anybody shows up with, stress or insomnia or whatever, to immediately prescribe an antidepressant. The idea of mild to moderate is just, it's just disregarded completely. There's no effort to restrict prescribing antidepressants to severe cases at all, as near as I can tell. So that is that's the source of the huge numbers of people taking these drugs. But then we also have to address, and there's no doubt that if they were prescribed less, there'd be less problem with withdrawal. But there's many millions of people taking these drugs right now who had no good reason to be on them and have been taking them for years. And so now the withdrawal problem is really in the tens of millions of people. It's not, it's not a minor problem for public health.
And that's why I think we are going to win this struggle, because of the sheer force of numbers. This is not a niche issue. This is affecting millions and millions of people. And one other way that we can facilitate change, of course, is through the media, and not just social media, but even the mainstream media. I mean, Luke and James and others have with one of our large national newspapers here in the UK, run an ongoing campaign around antidepressants, which has reached many, many people. And just this Sunday coming, we are publishing a research paper documenting the numbers of people on Facebook groups supporting one another, including Adele's work and many others, and that's going to be covered on Sky News all day long on Sunday, and just getting the word out that way and normalizing these issues by making them spoken about at every possible opportunity. Now, I realize you don't all have the same access to that, but everybody can write a letter to the newspaper. That shows my age, doesn't it? No one writes letters to the newspaper anymore except me. But of course, there's Twitter and Facebook and all those other places where we can all continue to shine a light on this issue. It's out of the bottle now. It's not going to go back in the bottle. We just need to keep focusing on it, all of us, and to the extent that we can.
Yes,
Thank
I think that people who are taking the drugs, if they know that other people are having the same problem, it's very helpful to them. And yes, getting that information out in the mass media is useful. But that has been going on for decades.
Sure.
So the demand is huge. The distribution of the drugs is huge, and the problems in coming off are also going to be huge in terms of numbers.
Yeah, certainly in the UK, we've had a lot of publicity. I remember when I first came off and James and I set up CEP, we turned to the Times, and the Times ran a front page news story on withdrawal from sleeping pills, and it was a big splash, and it was followed up with 6 or 7 articles after that, all first or second page. This was the main headline for the Times, and that's a big deal. And I thought, wow, we're really going to see some change now. I mean, if the Times are behind it. And sure enough, absolutely nothing happened as a result of that. And I think what we wised up to was that you can have all the media coverage in the world, but you've got to line that up with awareness among policymakers and critically the support of the medical institutions themselves. Yep. So I think that one of the things that has worked well over here has been ensuring that we did eventually get the support of the British Medical Association for this. We actually got the support of the Royal College of Psychiatrists for many of the things that we're doing as well. Because when you turn to policymakers, who are they going to turn to say, are these people telling me something sensible, or is it nonsense? Well, they're going to turn to the head of the BMA, the president of the BMA, the president of the Royal College. And if those people are saying the wrong things, you're not going to get anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so it's really about bringing all of these different institutions together, making sure that everything is lined up. And only at that point, I think, will you see the sort of change that is beginning to happen here. I mean, I'm cautiously hopeful. I'm very conscious that, in the UK, we've been working on this for many years, and yet, in concrete terms, there's not a huge amount that's happened. There's been some changes to guidance and one or two other things. There's still a lot of expectation for what is coming down the pipe. But I do think we will see these things happening over the next few years, and hopeful that in 10 years we'll look back with some satisfaction. But there's a long way to go.
I think what I'd like to kind of observe is that maybe 5 to 10 years ago, somebody new coming into psychiatry, if they'd done a web search or a ResearchGate search for withdrawal, they would have come across a whole pile of papers saying it's mild and self-limiting and it lasts a couple of weeks and it's not a big problem and it's quite rare. Recently, because of the work of some of you here and many others, that there's been quite an influx, I think, of papers in psychiatric journals talking about the withdrawal phenomenon, not just for antidepressants, but for antipsychotics and benzodiazepines and other classes of drugs too. So I think people coming new into this, if they have an interest in that and start to look for that information, it's there, and it's saying this is a bigger problem than was previously recognized. And I think that a lot of that effort has come from the patient voice and Adele, your site, and all the other sites on Facebook, and people sharing their experiences and telling newspapers about it and recording interviews and telling friends and family. So I think this is a gigantic team effort that everybody's been involved in, and I do think progress has been made, and that's incredibly heartening for someone like me that's kind of experienced this.
There's a question that I spotted from Stuart Shipko in the States, who's a psychiatrist that I spoke to quite early on and was quite helpful to me. And he's asked, how can a doctor make a plan to stop a drug when so many people cannot stop or get disabling illness when they try to stop? I think that's in response to what I was saying earlier about this informed consent agreement. And the point of the informed consent agreement would be that that these drugs should, if they are prescribed, they should be prescribed for the short term. And so hopefully, in most cases where people are prescribed them short term, coming off is more straightforward. That's not always the case. But I think there's another point here, which is around really the scale of this and what the appropriate approach is, given that if you've got tens of millions of people who've been on, for example, antidepressants for, in some cases, a decade or two, it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for everybody to come off. Some people are going to find themselves in such difficulty coming off that it might be better for them at least to stay on for a period. You've got to be, it's before you start that process, you don't know whether you're going to be one of the lucky ones who can come off in a relatively straightforward way, or for whom it's going to be much more torturous and difficult and perhaps interfere with your functioning. And I wouldn't want, it would be very hard for a lot of people to manage withdrawal at the same time as they're managing their lives. And so, I don't think there is a simple answer for everybody here. I think you've got to do this very cautiously and to make sure that it's all done at the patient's choice, that we don't have a system. One of the risks, I suppose, with some of what we're trying to do is that we get a lot of doctors saying, right, I'm going to start taking people off. That would probably be a very bad thing. We need it to be done with the consent of the patient and at the patient's pace. And if they don't want to come off, they shouldn't be forced to.
I know that Stuart Shipko has been very, very cautious in tapering, and he still sees problems. I'm seeing problems on my website, people tapering very, very carefully. And they often have to take breaks and stay at one dose for 6 months or 2 years, or this is really difficult. I have to say that most people probably will be able to come off with a very gradual taper, as described by Horowitz and Taylor in their 2019 paper about tapering antidepressants, which was followed by another paper about tapering antipsychotics. Most people will be able to, it's my belief that most people will be able to come off with those very gradual exponential tapers. However, there's going to be some people who have difficulties, and those difficulties can be pretty significant. We really do need to have medical professionals involved in researching this process and understanding how to deal with those issues that come up. And that is one thing that's been lacking. Well, of course, as almost everything has been lacking, but that's another thing that's been lacking, is any attention whatsoever to the process of tapering and what happens if there are, how to deal with the pitfalls. We attempt on my website, we attempt to provide techniques to deal with the pitfalls, but really it's just, all we can do is to suggest that people confer with their doctors and maybe slightly increase their dosage or hold at one dosage. As peer counselors, we don't have any ability to prescribe additional drugs or the knowledge just isn't there to deal with a bad result. And this really does need to be addressed because these people end up in the protracted withdrawal bin. So there could be conceivably millions of people walking around with protracted withdrawal right now who don't know it because they've come off their drugs. They've been feeling odd for years, and nobody knows what their problem is. In the UK, there's a wastebasket diagnosis called medically unexplained symptoms. There's another diagnosis that might be used, that's functional neurological disorder. Again, these are sort of like, we don't know what it is, but we're going to give it a name kind of labels. In the United States, who knows what these conditions are called? They may be called um, um, depression that's resistant to treatment, and then those people might be getting electric shock therapy for supposed treatment-resistant depression. So there could be people, many people wandering around trying to get treatment for something that really needs to be addressed on its own as an iatrogenic condition. Again, since the early 2000s, when the sales of antidepressants took off, followed by new antipsychotics and so forth, millions of people have been exposed. This is a rolling total of hundreds of millions of people. So I'm certainly hoping that, my sense is that there's so many people been exposed and so many people had a bad result, that we've reached a tipping point where it's really getting out into the general understanding, and it's growing into a consumer movement to demand better patient safety in the prescribing of these drugs, and more knowledge about tapering.
Thank you all. That was really helpful to talk about some of those issues. We're just past 7 o'clock here in the UK, so if it's okay, I'd like to move on to bring some viewer questions forward, if that's okay. And again, please feel free to jump in on these. Thank you to all of you that ask questions. We've of course got more than we can answer, but we'll try and answer as many as we can, and we'll try and take forward those that we can't. So to kick off with, someone's asked, curious why we refer to it as withdrawal, which might get conflated with addiction, and who gets to name it. So I wonder if anybody has any thoughts on that. I know for me, language is quite a thing around this. So, what are your thoughts?
Well, for many years, this is sort of, the table was set by addiction medicine. And for many years, addiction medicine called addiction and dependency the same thing. They were synonymous. In recent years, it's actually been recognized that these are two different conditions. And this was incorporated into the DSM-5. Addiction is dependence is every psychotropic, any psychotropic, whether it's addictive or not, if you take it frequently enough, your nervous system will adapt to the psychotropic. And that, as it adapts, it becomes dependent on the psychotropic. So if you take the drug away, then you have withdrawal. And that's whether the drug is, legal or not legal, or considered addictive or not addictive. So physiological dependence, and I think that the people who are having difficulty getting off of benzodiazepines often encounter this from their doctors. Physical dependence is independent of addiction. It's a difficulty in going off. And the benzodiazepine people are sometimes accused of their doctors of being addictive and drug seeking when they want to have their prescriptions extended so they can taper. People who are taking who've become dependent on opioids without even because of recovering from an operation and having pain treatment, they become inadvertently dependent on opioids. And they, for a while, were lumped in with the people who were addicted to opioids. But now there's recognition by the FDA in the United States that opioid dependence is different from opioid addiction. Addiction is and I have my reservations about this too, but it's a psychological, it's sort of like a psychological state in relationship to the drug. And and a person can be both addicted and dependent, but a person can also be dependent without being addicted. Does that clarify it?
That's really helpful. Thank you, Adela. And I think it's probably also worth mentioning, and this might be contentious for some, but some of you might have gone to your doctors and explained what's been happening, and your doctor will say, oh, it's something called discontinuation syndrome. Now, discontinuation syndrome means something in medical circles that it may not mean quite the same for service user or patient populations. So, discontinuation is a term which is popular in those kind of circles. So it's a small language point, but you may well hear that. But I tend to say withdrawal, and I know other people like me do.
Can I jump in on that, James, which is, this is where language really matters. And this is an area where I think patients have the right to feel pretty aggrieved by the use of language, the historical use of language, and the current use of language by the medical establishment and by doctors. Discontinuation syndrome was a phrase conjured up by the pharmaceutical industry to minimize the withdrawal, to cover up the fact that antidepressants cause withdrawal. It's shocking that happened, and it's shocking that language continues to be used. And I'm pleased to say that in the UK, at least, there has been recent recognition and agreement by some areas of the medical establishment not to use that term, discontinuation syndrome, anymore. It just shouldn't be used. It's wrong. Where I'm also pretty unhappy is the ongoing denial by the medical establishment that antidepressants cause dependence. There are many psychiatrists who will say that they don't cause dependence and will refuse to use that phrase. And they'll say, well, they don't cause tolerance, and they don't cause drug-seeking behavior, and they don't cause drug escalation, things which aren't actually true. We know that antidepressants can what's called poop out, that you can stop having the same effect in the same dose, so you do actually need a higher dose in many cases after a period of time. But again, there is this obfuscation, this denial, this tendency by the medical establishment to try and cover up these things. But again, I think some of that is changing, but we all must make sure that we are very firm when we use this language and use the right terms, and not let our doctors get away with it.
I just jump in and add that I think one of the important things there, Luke, that you said was the origin of the term, and that it was a pharmaceutical term, and that raises the issue of the extent to which our medical professions, especially in America, and especially psychiatry, has become enmeshed with the drug companies. And until they develop a proper ethical professional boundary between themselves and the drug companies, this sort of distortion is going to continue. It's just important to name that, I think, because that's been the elephant in the room for a long, long time. And there's slow progress being made on that as well. I think more psychiatrists and medical doctors are recognizing the need to separate themselves from drug company funding.
I would say that there's a real lack of clarity in medicine about psychotropics in general. And this has become clear in terms when the opioid epidemic emerged, and it became clear that there were many people who were inadvertently dependent on opioids. It's also true of the benzodiazepine issue, where people were given benzodiazepines and told that they were antidepressants and had no idea that they were technically addictive. In general, medicine does not understand psychotropics very well. And whether they're addictive, addictive means that they've been, a drug has been put in a legal basket called addictive. And it appears as though, let's say, the gabapentinoids are heading towards that basket. But there's really no chemical distinction between an addictive drug and a non-addictive drug. They all may cause dependency if you take them long enough. So what we're perceiving as the sellout of medicine to the pharmaceutical companies, well, that has been, that is partially true, or even mostly true. But also, they just don't get it about psychotropics. They just don't get that if you apply them long enough, that an adaptation is going to occur and withdrawal happens after that. In addiction medicine, there's a lot of denial about withdrawal symptoms as well. And it's only recently that protracted withdrawal syndrome has become, well, sort of semi-accepted in addiction medicine. And the incidence of protracted withdrawal syndrome in addiction medicine is high. It's considered to be one of the main reasons people go back to the drug, which shouldn't be a surprise because that's what stops withdrawal symptoms, which, and that's known to be true for the psychiatric drugs. So, this is a much larger conceptual issue in medicine than just the psychiatric drugs, but for sure, because psychiatric drugs are prescribed as being very, highly therapeutic and effective. There are more hurdles for us to jump over to educate the profession.
Thank you all so much. I'm keen to move on because time's pushing on. So a bit of a different tack, but there's quite a few questions around how can I best support a loved one who has recently come off and, is in the kind of early stages of dealing with that post-withdrawal period. So, I wonder if any of you had any reflection on that.
Well, it's incredibly hard for families and loved ones to cope when somebody is going through certainly the initial stages of withdrawal, and so many things can affect that person's behavior, that person's thinking, that person's emotions, which are just down to the drugs. And I suppose that would be the first bit of advice to a family member is to realize that whatever you're seeing and hearing from that person, and anything that you're thinking is not really the person that well, it isn't the person because these are drug effects. These are not linked to the individual, and it will get better. I think that in my experience, having good family support has made an enormous difference to the trajectory of somebody's withdrawal, and it's certainly the case in my case and others that I've come across, is that where family members have educated themselves, have spent some time looking up the research, looking up websites, talking to other peer support members, perhaps to some of the withdrawal counsellors that exist. There are wonderful people in the UK and elsewhere that do help and do this. And that enables the family members then to get into a position where they can provide understanding and support, rather than what often happens, which is listening to the doctor who may not necessarily understand what is going on and may ascribe it to other things. So I think realizing that it's not really your loved one and educating yourself as best you can, those are critical things that you can do as a family member.
I think that family members should also understand that recovery from protracted withdrawal is extremely slow, and the person may suffer frequent surges of symptoms that may cause might cause a lot of upset, and I think that everyone really needs to focus on the fact that the nervous system really does want to go back to normal functioning, and it rebuilds itself very slowly. Just having that support and understanding and the expectation of slow recovery, I think, can help people a great deal.
Might be worth giving a shout out to, obviously, Adele's site it's got lots and lots of information, but there are other sites. The CEP site has information, has videos that we've specifically targeted at other family members. And then the Withdrawal project, from Inner Compass Initiative, has a vast amount of information to help family members educate themselves and support their loved ones.
And I think also I'd mention, John and Luke, you've both been involved in work with psychological support for, people undergoing withdrawal themselves and family members. And I think it's important for us all to remember that there's a physical element to it, there's a psychological element to it, there's an awful lot that needs to be addressed for people in the first stages of getting off, isn't there? It's not just a medical thing or just fix your diet, or there's a whole plethora of things that need to be attended to.
I mean, the work that we've been doing for therapists, we've provided, and this has been led by Anne Guy over in the UK, and there is a publication at prescribedrug.info, which has been published through the APPG here in the UK, but also with other therapy organisations. So it's had a lot of support. It's been a long-term project, and it's wonderful guidance for therapists who are talking to their clients about psychiatric drugs and withdrawal. And if there are any online, I'd urge you to go and look at that. But there is also something to be discussed around the appropriateness of traditional forms of talking therapy while someone is going through withdrawal. Often in this country, people are put into a CBT program, and that may be incredibly helpful for them when they're receptive, when they're able to cope. But when their thinking is as distorted as it often becomes during withdrawal, it can be very counterproductive to go through that experience, to go through a talking therapy, that kind of modality. That's not to say that a therapist can't give one enormous support by listening and encouraging. I mean, when I was going through the worst of withdrawal, I had two different phone lines that I would ring up. One was in the UK called the Bristol and District Tranquilizer Project, and the wonderful, wonderful Ian Singleton was on the end of the line, and every day I asked him the same question. Ian, this is really bad. Am I going to get better? Yes, Luke, you're going to get better. I just needed to hear that from somebody. And then the saintly Baylissa Fredericks, who ran Recovery Road, she was the other person, and poor Ian and Baylissa, it was a sort of ping pong between the two of them for a couple of years. And so that reassurance when you're going through withdrawal, that this is temporary, it will pass. It may be hell and it may turn your world upside down, but you're going to get there.
Yes, on my website, we have a section for success stories of people who have recovered from withdrawal. And there are probably about 150 now. And many of these people had been on my website for years and asked the same question: will I ever get, will this ever be over? Will I ever get better? And reading their stories is really fascinating, because you can go back and you can see the history of all the questioning that they went through, all of their existential doubts. I mean, it's very heartbreaking, because sometimes the disability causes failures of marriages and businesses. People lose their jobs. It's heartbreaking, but it's amazing how they reassemble themselves, and I think that's very, very instructive. Besides showing that people do recover from withdrawal, it's a very long, painful process. and I wish that it didn't happen. So I want to encourage everybody to slowly taper if you go off your drugs, and do not ever cold turkey or skip doses to taper.
Yeah, those messages are so important, Adele, and I think I'd add myself that, don't be discouraged by setbacks. I've found that this is not a linear process. I didn't get better a little bit every single day. Some days I did well, and some weeks I did terribly, but try not, easy to say, but try not to be discouraged if you feel you're not moving forward. You are, it's just slower than you realize. But, I think it's important that we all support each other through Facebook groups and various websites and whatever. But I think maintaining some hope for the future is very important.
Well, no, I'm aware you haven't said anything for a little while. Thought you might want to get in.
I'm waiting for a question.
Okay.
Q&A.
Well, Swapnil, I can ask you one then. So a viewer has asked, with your work in deprescribing, what have you done, or have you had any pushback from mainstream psychiatry about it? And if so, what have you done about that?
I think there has been some pushback. I mean, a very clear example was when my colleagues John Cahill and Rebecca Miller, we published this paper called Deprescribing Antipsychotics, a Guide for Clinicians. There was a response published in the same journal titled Deprescribing Antipsychotics, Witless and Dangerous, which I thought was incredible because my stance on deprescribing antipsychotics is pretty gentle and extremely careful, rooted in shared decision making and recovery oriented prescribing. So so there is, short answer is yes, there is a certain amount of pushback. But at the same time, there are a number of colleagues who are interested, cautiously interested, let me say. I think because being interested in a venture like deprescribing psychotropics involves being honest about not knowing a lot of things, which can be challenging for a number of individuals. So, but certainly I have been, encouraged by the amount of interest that psychiatrists have shown in the topic. What I've heard most often is, we know that this person is on too many drugs. We want to help them taper off. We don't know how. That's what I've heard most often.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for your candor with that. And I'm seeing in the chat quite a few people saying they'd like to see you on Twitter. So, so they could follow you for your work. So
I'm not on Twitter. I think I may have gotten on briefly to check out somebody's tweets, but then I came back out.
Oh, you've got followers in waiting. I'm conscious that we're in the last 5 minutes of our time here, and I'm sorry we didn't get through too many questions, but the questions themselves are so good, and the responses need to be quite detailed. So we will try and endeavour to address more as we go on. I have seen some frustration in the chat that we didn't get into details today. I'd reiterate, this is a series of discussions. This is the first one in a series, and we will get into more detail. It was important and necessary to try and set the scene, and we're not all in the same place on this. Some of our viewers are new to this, so I just wanted to try and address that. I want to thank you all so much for watching and attending, and for your questions, and for the lively chat that's happened today. It's been great to see you all get involved. I do want to mention we have our second discussion arranged for March the 12th, and for the next town hall we will be discussing the mechanisms that underlie withdrawal itself. So we'll be asking what the scientific models and theories tell us about why withdrawal occurs and how we might respond. And we'll be posting more information about that on Mad in America in the next couple of weeks. So keep an eye there. We are developing a list of topics to cover, and if you have thoughts on that, you can get in touch with us using the email address withdrawal@madinamerica.com, because we want viewers to be as involved in setting these discussions as we go on as much as possible. If you have found today useful and you want to help contribute to more of these discussions, then please consider donating to help us do more of these. So just visit madinamerica.com, click the donate button. I am aware that many of you watching have already donated, and we're so hugely grateful for your support to help us put these on. So thank you so much. A quick reminder that if you do have questions arising from today, we do have our page of resources, which we're updating. It's madinamerica.com/PDW. There are links to the various groups that we've mentioned, including Surviving Antidepressants, Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry, Inner Compass. There are quite a few of the papers linked there that we've referenced to in this discussion. And really, I want to thank the panel all for giving up their time. Early for some, later for others, but I've got a lot out of hearing you all speak, and I'm so grateful that we could get together. So in the last couple of minutes, I just throw it open to you to share any final thoughts.
Well, I'll just say what I always say, which has now become a bit of a cliche. The struggle we're involved with is a very, very difficult one, and some of you have been involved with it almost as long as I have. And how difficult it is matched by how wonderful the people are that you meet along the way. And I just want to say that's how I feel about my fellow panel members and lots of people that I've seen putting their remarks down the bottom. We're all in this together, and yes, do it slowly, carefully, with support, but know that there are literally millions of people going through the same thing. And there's lots of different ways to support one another through, like, Adele's website and other people's website, and Inner Compass, and Let's Talk Withdrawal. Hopefully the Institute can play a bit of a part, but we're all, lots of people in this together, and there are ways through it. So thanks for letting me be part of this evening.
Just to echo what John has said, I mean, it's hard to talk about this last period and use the word pleasure, but there has been an immense pleasure in getting to know so many of you, so many good, intelligent, energetic people who have just devoted so much of their time pro bono, not unpaid, to tackling this issue, and it brings out the best of humanity. I think when we all collectively encounter a problem that we realize is a deep, deep societal injustice, and we find that there are so many who are prepared to step forward and try and help, and it's been a pleasure working with so many. There are so many who aren't on today's panel, but there'll be many others in future panels, and you all know who you are. So thank you.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for attending, and James and Shira and Lucy for doing such a wonderful job on organizing this. Again, I do believe that we patients are our best ambassadors. I would urge people to join a Facebook group about your particular drug if you're on Facebook. We will be distributing information that is also distributed by the Facebook groups, and that's probably the most extensive network of information about this withdrawal issue and whatever campaigns we might devise. I'm on Twitter as Altistrada. I'm not going to be able to answer questions about individual tapering on Twitter. It's just not possible. But I will be tweeting out links to papers and other relevant information for people.
Well, thank you so much for organizing this. I think it's a great introduction to what needs to be a very long and what is going to be a messy conversation. I hope we keep up the complexity of the conversation and really don't look for any simple answers, honestly. So yeah, this is a wonderful introduction, and it's great to see the community coming together and talking about this. On my end, I'm going to keep up the work and keep talking to my colleagues, keep advocating, keep educating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for watching, for spending your time with us. Thank you to the panel and to Lucy and Shira. And I hope you might consider joining us again for our next discussion on March the 12th. But I've really enjoyed spending the time with you. So thank you so much.